Hey guys, welcome to our next video where we go over our Pro 2 Formula Drift S14. For this episode, we're going to break it down into 4 sections. We're going to cover how to make the best chassis possible for competitive drifting. We will cover the drivetrain front to back and why this is, in my opinion, the most indestructible drivetrain that you can put into a drift car. We will cover the suspension and the engineering behind it and why it performs as well as it does. And we will also cover the interior of the car, where I sit, why I sit that way, why my handbrake is where it is, and how my steering wheel is, and where all the buttons are. We'll cover everything that we possibly can. Okay, so for the chassis, on the exterior of the car, we have bolted on a car-modified Wonder Glare body kit straight from Japan, a Cybon carbon fiber hood that has been well used, as you can see. Couple seasons, couple walls, you know, that's kind of what happens. We put a big hole in it anyways for the intake. Working our way through the back, we actually worked with Kansai wheels for 2020 to get set up on the car. The problem was COVID-19 happened, and the wheels that I ordered I had delivered to Drift HQ, where I was going to go there to compete in Formula Drift. And because the borders closed and everything else closed, that no longer happened, and I was left with pretty much no wheels. So as a roller, we're sitting on my wheels from 2 seasons ago, but Kansai is is what I ran and what I'm going to be running this year. Going down the side, you can see that the aggression of this kit's really nice. Like, they've got flares and lines and ducts everywhere. The kit has all kinds of sharp edges, just making it a really aggressive body kit for the S14. It's a 50mm over, bringing us pretty much flush front and back. Coming around here, I will open up the trunk and I will open up the hood and show you the structure of the chassis, but just doing a quick walk around. We've got LED lights, Lexan window in the rear and glass window in the front. Seeing as this is kind of exterior and not really part of the drivetrain or anything else, our fuel setup and our rad setup is all exposed in the back. This is a pretty common setup for the S14 just because of the way it was designed. The fuel cell for the best weight distribution works perfectly sitting right between the 2 strut towers, giving you loads of room to put the rad in the back. Putting the rad in the back gives us really good weight distribution, lots of room to cool and evacuate the hot air, and it allows for a lot of freedom with what you can do up front and in the back, putting all that stuff here. So we'll show you that in a second. That pretty much does it for the outside of the chassis. Underneath, we've got, like, we stitch welded, we braced, we did all kinds of things to the car that's within regulations, including the roll cage. A fun fact about this car is actually this car belonged to an old Pro 1 driver named Dave Briggs. This is the only car that I haven't caged, that I have anything to do with. Basically every car that I've ever done for a customer or for anybody else, I obviously do the roll cages. I've been doing cages for a long time, but because of where my business went and how busy I am in my personal life with my kids and with business, the cage is still the same. And this cage really doesn't live up to my standard, but it does pass tech. We'll show you why I don't really like it. And if you want to know how I do build roll cages, you can just check out one of our previous videos where I did a in-depth overview of how you design and build a roll cage. My time has only become less available as we go on, so the cage is still the original one that's in the car. To continue with showing you the chassis of this car, we're going to open up the hood and take off the front fender and show you why this chassis is built so well and still within the rules that I can have an accident like this and still have my chassis intact without affecting any of the suspension pickup points and not bending the frame whatsoever. This was a pretty good hit, and as you can see, you want to come in and take a look. The damage that happened was pretty decent. It buckled some tubes, it folded some joints, but the important bits, our headlight was still fully intact and our chassis was untouched. mostly due to how much work I put into legally bracing everything and making sure that it's all within the FD rulebook specs. I'll take this off and give you guys a good look. All right, so underneath the fender, you can see everything that's exposed. Starting with, this is a 1/2-inch aluminum 6061 fender brace that I designed to fit the S14 and S15 chassis. Whether or not I would have to take this off at Formula Drift or not, it was unclear in the rule book, but to take it off isn't that big of a deal. So any other competitions I'm running in, I'm definitely having these installed for a couple reasons. The S chassis specifically, between the firewall, intrusion bars and roll cage, and the strut towers and tube front, this is kind of like a paper mache section of the car. The reason it's left untouched for Formula Drift regulations is because they want to maintain that crumple zone for front or side impacts, going to absorb the load of the accident and not hurt the driver, because the safety is the #1 concern, not necessarily the chassis rigidity, but from chassis to chassis, you're gonna see a lot different integral designs in this area, because some cars are designed to crumple in the front and behind the dash, and some are designed to crumple between the tower and the dash. So this chassis specifically was designed to do exactly that. You will buckle and destroy this section with any sort of impact. So we designed our tube front to work well with the style of this chassis, and then this brace here really complements the rest of the weak areas of the car. To go further into what I did to make this chassis so strong, we can kind of zoom in on this section where you can see a lot of bracing from the towers forward. This is what is legal within the FD rulebook. So we've got a tube brace here that ties in with the frame rail and connects to the strut tower all the way to the top, where we then bolt our tube front. This tube here also really increases the strength of this frame rail going from here forward. Going from here forward, we have an 1 3/4 tube that travels right to this tube, and then we have another rad support 1 3/4 tube that bends around, goes on to the other side, and we tie it all together with these gussets. This section here is basically impossible to destroy with any sort of impact. As you can see, this tube is completely destroyed. This bolt is bent, which is completely ideal in an accident like this. We can easily zip this bolt, this front end will come off, and we are left with a nice, perfect chassis, just like we had before we built this. And building another one of these is really easy. It attaches to the front with 4 1/2-inch bolts. The threads are internal. We can easily take these bolts out, remove this front end. We have a spare. We can bolt the spare on, and everything else is fine. The chassis is fine. We don't even have to change the alignment because of how stiff everything is around here. Another thing that you could do, which we couldn't because of our intake, is do a strut bar. I had plans to design one that would kind of X and go forward and tie in with this tube front and then go to the other side, but I just simply ran out of time. A strut bar would really tie this whole front end together and make it as strong as you want, and still allowing for this tube front or bash bar to absorb all the load, fail, and it's the easiest thing to replace. So that's what we went with on this front end. You can see everything really well. If we want to come in closer on this strut tower, get a good view of what's going on. This gusset is tied in with the entire chassis. This tube runs here. We've got a nice gusset piece there, making it so that nothing here is going to fail. This is what's going to fail, which is totally fine. Continuing on with the chassis discussion of this car, we have the roll cage. This cage was not built by me. It came with the chassis, and because of my time restraints that I mentioned before, and the way that it was built, it passes tech, it does the job. I didn't have any time, send it. Like, I'm just gonna focus on getting this car as indestructible as possible for the drivetrain, the suspension, the cooling, and heat management, everything that we needed to do to make this a solid car. It didn't have we didn't have to change the cage. But anyways, here it is. The previous builder did a X door bar and a NASCAR style door bar. I'm assuming they wanted the chassis stiffness of an X, but then they wanted the side impact safety of a NASCAR style. Best of both worlds, throw it all together. Yeah, to each their own. It's not my design, it's not what I would have done, but that's fine. The fitment of it it's not terrible, but it's not great. There's a couple gaps kind of everywhere. It does touch pretty well here, and the forehead bar is a bit low for my liking. I'm also super tall, so it hasn't been too big of an issue. I haven't really noticed, but I just wouldn't have done it this way. So it's well built to most people's standards, just not to ours. Now we're gonna take the trunk off and show you all of the chassis specific stuff that I did under here. This is actually a really well used and abused rear trunk lid. I had a new one from 2F Performance that is stuck over the border, and I haven't been able to get it for close to a year now. So if you think this is ugly, that's because it is. And I do have a new one, but I couldn't go get it. So let's look under here. You're gonna see a lot of tire shrapnel, a lot of dirt. That's because that's what goes on back here. We burn a lot of tires, we make a big mess. So I'm not really too concerned about showing you all of that because that's just the reality of this. But there's a lot going on back here. There's a lot of tubes, there's a lot of swinging tail lights that I made. You've got your rear rad, you've got your AccuSump. But come and take a close look. So this tubular construction was made to hold my fenders, my lights, my rad supports, and it was designed to make everything really easy to work on, so I have lots of room to go around things. With drift cars, zip ties are used a lot because you can cut them quick, you can put them back on quick, and just for things like wires or lines, sometimes a zip tie is better than an actual bracket. For the chassis, I designed these tail lights mounts. They actually pivot on a swivel, so they're really easy to kind of align with your body kit and set up. If you do end up while tapping something or affecting this, it will just simply spin out of the way and you can easily reset it and keep going. This is our R1 CSF rad. It's a triple bypass rad that comes with AN fittings already welded on it. It is the rad that I recommend for everybody. And we've got a big derail fan shroud, really easy to buy. We can actually sell you these. Comes with 4,000 CFM fans already installed. The derail shroud can be easily adapted to most rads. With this one, it almost fits perfectly. You just got to drill a couple holes, make a little L bracket, and it goes right on. The rear bash bar going on here, it's honestly as simple as it gets because I'm just used to demolishing these things. So it's just some DOM tube, a couple extra bracing to protect our AccuSump, but it simply bolts onto a triple boxed rear square frame. The rear square frame of this car was designed to never be the failing point. This square will maintain its shape. No matter what you hit, this isn't going to crumble, everything else is. That's the way I wanted it to be. So tripled it up, gives us a little more weight, gives us a lot of integral strength, and makes sure that anything that we bolt to it is gonna fail before it does, because this is our core of the strength of the rear chassis. Coming in really close, I've got the chassis and the box and everything built into the firewall. It's kind of all one piece going on back here. The fuel cell sits inside of this sheet metal construction that I've made. And in the sheet metal construction, it gives us the ability to mount bulkhead fittings for all of our AN lines. So we've got our AN lines for our water, AN lines for our fuel, all going through a bulkhead, all sealed to meet the requirement of a firewall. And then it kind of ties everything together and makes it look really neat. Everything else for the firewall, we've got our wire connection coming through a plug. And yeah, everything's just kept really clean and simple. Simple is key when it comes to dealing with setting up a drift car. So to go along with the chassis, I'm just gonna throw in the fuel setup and the coolant setup because that doesn't really fall under drivetrain or interior or suspension. So it's gonna fall under chassis category for me. Starting with this is just simply my overflow. This is my rad cap, which when the system builds up pressure, it overflows into here. This is not a pressurized canister. It simply vents to atmosphere and it will fill up and go back down as my pressure increases and decreases within the system. Keeping the Coolant system simple is another thing that is just key. I'll go over a couple things in the front, like for the LS engines, your steam port and your distribution of the water, where you put your water pump. This is all really important stuff to having like a flawless system. This car, I can confidently say, has absolutely zero problems with bleeding, with keeping temperatures down. It's just a really efficient system that I could walk anybody through for doing on an LS setup. For the fuel system setup, we actually have a CFC unit from Nuke Performance. CFC stands for Competition Fuel Cell Unit. Inside of here, you have a 2-liter surge tank that has 2 DW400 pumps constantly pressurizing the car. And then you have a single DW400 pump picking up the fuel and putting it into the surge tank. So that surge tank is never going to be empty, and you will always have pressure. Doesn't matter how long you're in a corner, doesn't matter what you're doing with the car, you will have fuel pressure 100% of the time if you're running a CFC unit. The one thing that I regret not getting, but I did just buy one, is the level sending unit. Because when this is running E85, you burn fuel really quickly, especially with the engine like what we have. And I was just constantly filling up with fuel to make sure that I had fuel, and it's kind of annoying to do that because you should just know what you're at. So I would recommend, if you do go ahead with this setup, which is a competition proven setup, get a level unit so that you know. This is just a really simple construction, kind of time constraint, so it's not the prettiest thing, but basically this is where our fuel goes in. It's really tight. I'll get that in. Good night. That is so tight. There we go. This is where our 85 gets put in. It was actually pretty tricky to get any kind of grade on this tube because the fuel cell was so high, and I had already made my plate for here. I was like, yeah, I gotta get it going down, but I've actually never had a problem with dumping fuel in this and having it come back up. It hasn't happened yet, so I'm happy with it. It's clean, it looks good, it's really easy to fill. I've seen a lot of setups where they just put a spout right onto the fill cap here. And I gotta tell you, when you're bent over backwards, full race suit, trying to fill up your car, whether you have a team or not, it's pretty annoying doing it from over here. From the side of the car with this, it makes it a lot easier. So I would recommend putting something like this away from the fuel cell. That's really easy to access. Fuel system. So from the CFC unit, we're gonna go through our 10 micron Nuke Performance fuel filter into our bulkhead, and then through the fuel lines under the car up into our fuel pressure regulator, which is located in the engine bay. Just to finish off back here, I didn't really touch on the AccuSump. AccuSumps are really simple units. Basically, it is an oil accumulator. There's a piston installed in this AccuSump. When you get an AccuSump, you're gonna be getting it with the piston fully closed at this end. And generally, when you install the AccuSump, you put, like, let's say you put 7 liters in the engine, that's what it takes. You start the engine up, you let the oil pressure build, then you shut the car off. As soon as you shut the car off, this solenoid then closes, because this solenoid opens and closes with the accessories switch on the car. That means this solenoid closes, and that means that this cylinder now has 2 quarts of oil in it. Because it's a sealed unit, that is going to build air pressure on this side of the canister. So you're going to have 2 quarts of oil in here with, let's say your engine pressured up to 40 psi, you will have 40 psi of air pressure here. So let's say you've got your 2 quarts of oil there, 40 psi of air is on this side. What that's doing is pushing on the oil, forcing it through this line and back into the block. Anytime you get any kind of starvation, an AccuSump is just constantly balancing the oil pressure that is made by the engine. The AccuSump doesn't do anything on its own. It's all just a reserve pressure from the engine. So I have a high pressure and a high volume Melling oil pump in my engine. So I get up to 70, 80 psi of oil pressure. I'm going to get the same pressure at this gauge as I have on my engine gauge. That's because they're directly connected. This AccuSump is said to give you a reserve of 30 seconds of oil pressure. That means if you lost oil pressure in your engine, there is enough air pressure in this system to push 2 quarts of oil through your engine for almost 30 seconds. Now, I know there's no guarantee. I know there's nothing that can say that that's gonna save your engine or not, but if you do lose oil pressure, even for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, you're on a really long right-hand corner and the sump stops picking up from your oil pan, this will float basically that pressure drop by once the pump reduces in pressure because it's not picking up, it's not scavenging any oil. This is gonna then say, okay, there's a pressure difference. I'm gonna balance out by giving my pressure back to the engine. That's all this does. It's really simple, really basic. I would recommend putting these on any engine if you're running a wet sump. We will be switching to a dry sump this year, not because we had failures or problems. It's able to give you a lot more potential for higher RPM abuse because that system, I'm not gonna go into explaining it, but it makes sure that you have full pressure all the time. There is never a hiccup or a spot where you're not gonna have oil pressure. You've got 3 scavenge pumps, 1 pressure pump. Oil is always being, yeah, anyways, I'm not gonna go into it, so I could, but we're switching to a dry sump. Again, not because this doesn't work, but because it's just better for what we wanna do. We wanna run over 8,000 RPM, and to do that, you're gonna want a dry sump system because the dry sump pump doesn't rely on a pickup, a mechanical pickup. It relies on an external pressure that you're constantly giving to the engine. When you get up to 8,000 RPM, you will start cavitating the oil with a wet sump. All kinds of things are gonna happen. It really depends on how the engine's built, and not too many engines are built to handle that high of RPM on a wet sump system. That's why we're changing. I still recommend these in any case. That's it for there. One last thing for the back, we've got our 2 Optima red top batteries. These weigh 33 pounds each, I believe, located as low as possible and as close to the rear axles as we could in the back, while still having access to our suspension, sway bars, stiff. This is just a really low center of gravity and a really great way to add weight since there are limits on adding ballast to your car. They allow up to 50 pounds of ballast weight to be distributed with your chassis. So when you're corner balancing, that's the maximum you're allowed to move around. With batteries, since you're allowed 2 batteries, these are heavy. These can be considered ballasts from a builder's perspective, and we can put them as low and close to the axles as we can. That's gonna give us the most grip potential, the best weight distribution. And since these cars balance out around without having a modified chassis, they are front heavy. This is a good way to get it a little more balanced, closer to 50-50. This car is not 50-50, but getting it close is done with moving your fuel cell, rad, batteries, AccuSump, all this stuff back here. That's how you do it. That's the best way to do it. So I think that just about covers everything for a chassis, just as a really quick overview. I mean, I have thousands of hours. That means I could talk about this car for at least a couple hours, but we're gonna try and keep it to like 20, 25 minutes. So yeah, that's the chassis. Next up on the build breakdown overview is the drivetrain. We're gonna try and cover everything in it, front to back. Maybe not specifically the parts that are in the engine. I'll cover the main bits, but normally I have shocks installed. You can see I have like a little ball here and a little hole there. I actually had shocks here, but we just took them off, so forgive my stick. This is gonna do just fine. So the drivetrain front to back, this is a 440 LSX block. It's actually a 454 LSX block. What we did to change it is what makes it a 440. Built by my friend at Fab Mac Industries. You can see his little logo here on the cover. We went with LME Brodex heads. This is fully built by Fab Mac Industries, by the way. They're his specs, they're his build. This is actually an insane NA engine. If you want to go NA and you want to get a lot of power and you want it to be reliable, this is the guy to go to. It's a 14-to-1 compression. 661 wheel horsepower is what we made on a Mustang style dyno. Take that as you will. Some people say it reads 10% under, whatever. This car has an insane amount of power for an NA engine. I'll take this cover off here in a second and show you what I did underneath. I wanted this intake to be as low as possible. It's a massive intake, and we run a massive AccuFab 4150 throttle body, 4-barrel. It's huge. I had to make a couple custom linkages and things to make it work with this car, but if you get into a pro car like this, fabricating little things like that should be the least of your worries. The engine itself, indestructible. Like, it's got a Cali's crank, center balanced, everything's lightweight, rotating. Everything on the engine I wanted to cover. Just to go back to the chassis a little bit, that was the coolant setup, as like I showed you the rear. This is where all the water goes. This is our coolant distribution system that comes from the engine. The top of the block and the bottom of the block are going to the same side manifold. This is our steam port system. This is a really crucial part of any LS engine. You want to have the steam ports venting to the highest point in the coolant system, because this is where the air pockets come and build up, collect, and then go back into the coolant system. So, for example, when I'm pumping the water through this setup, I'll simply take this line off and I will pump and pump and pump the water until I see water come out of here. I stick the hose back on, close it up, and it's literally bled. This is the highest point in the engine. This is where you're gonna collect all your air bubbles, and builders that have steam ports either blocked, or if they have them joined one head to the other, which is how the factory comes, and then they have the rears blocked. This is all bad idea. These can airlock the coolant system, and they can cause you to overheat the engine without even knowing that it's overheating, and you will nuke it. So steam ports on LS engines, really important. Just touching on that because we're in here. The drivetrain for my belt setup is super simple. Just a high output alternator made on a custom bracket that bolts to the side of the block, driven from a underdrive ATI balancer. Really, really simple. I run a electric power steering pump. It's a hydraulic pump, but it creates hydraulic pressure using an electric motor. I need a lot of power to run my fuel pumps, my water pumps, my hydraulic pumps, my fans. I need a lot of hydro to do this. So basically, this is a high output alternator, and that's all I need to run this entire car. And it was absolutely flawless all year. I never had a single issue in this area of the chassis. But moving from the back of the block, going backwards, we've got a 7¼ inch dual disc quartermaster clutch. So this is a unique setup that not too many people have seen. It actually runs no flywheel. It runs what's called a ring gear and a dual disc 7¼ clutch. The whole assembly weighs about 11 pounds with the button. The button is what most people would refer to as a flywheel. The button is what the clutch pack bolts to, and the button bolts to the engine. So it's a really lightweight setup. That's why this engine, it's already nasty and sounds crazy. But once you limit the rotating mass on these, that's what gets you into that NASCAR sounding-ish territory. Why? Because that is what NASCARs run. This is technically a NASCAR clutch. This clutch was built specifically for drifting, using thicker discs and only 2 of them. It distributes the heat a little bit better with all the clutch kicking. I still managed to cook it fairly quickly, so we're gonna look at that again. But it is better than like a triple disc NASCAR clutch. So that's what we're running there. That's why this engine sounds, you can have 2 built engines and this one will still sound better, mostly because there is no rotating mass. Going past the clutch, we have a GSR G-Force dog box 4-speed. This is like your tried and true transmission that works. It's a top shift, so it doesn't have any linkages on the side. The tunnel can be nice and small and it'll still fit. I would recommend a GSR to anybody. Like, it just works. It's super robust. It's easy to rebuild. The parts are readily available. And I've had mine for, well, this dog box has actually gone through many seasons through Pro 1 with Dave Briggs, and then I just did a little refresh and I've run it for 2 years now. Not a single problem. Had to change a couple dog rings because they wear out as you use them. No problem at all. Really easy to swap out. Beyond that, we've got our carbon fiber drive shaft, and then that goes into our independent rear suspension when there's quick change. This is the 800 horsepower spool quick change that we have. Then we have the drive shaft shop 1000 horsepower axles going to our grip kit. Not a single problem, front to back. Never had to do anything except for the bolts backing out of the axles. Super common. I actually have an extension about this long. Every time I do 2 tire changes, I just stick the impact through and check all the bolts. I've never broken them since, but I did break them last year. Right off the line, go off the line, snaps them. You got a lot of grip in this car, so when you're taking off, That's where you're gonna see the most load from a takeoff or from a big clutch kick. And I snapped all 6 bolts. It's definitely common. Always check those and you'll never have an issue. The CVs, the axle shafts themselves, I think they're pretty much impossible to break. From what I've heard from a lot of other drivers, these axles are like 6 years old now. So that just goes to show you how tough they are. Because I clutch kick a lot. And put this drivetrain through a lot of abuse. And it takes all of it. So for the drivetrain, that's pretty much it. If you want to go into detail with the engine and what's actually in it and how we were able to make that much power, click on the link and hit up Fab Mac Industries for your own build or parts or whatever you would want. He's really knowledgeable with building these engines. We were actually just going to make a couple changes to the cam, and we're hoping to push 700 wheel horsepower on E85 out of this engine. I think it's easily done, but we don't want to make it too peaky where you're only making power after 3,500, 4,000 RPM. We want to make it a really usable power band, which this currently is at 661 wheel. Anytime you hit the gas, like it's go, go, go. There's no delay in power when it comes to this engine. So I'll just zap this off. We'll give you a quick look at what I did, and then we'll move on to the suspension bits. So underneath our K&N filter is this drop plate that I built. I'm pretty sure you can buy these from out of like carbon fiber, but they didn't quite drop as much as I wanted it to. I just wanted the best line of sight that I could get. My entire throttle mechanism is underneath this. It's a pretty big cam that articulates and has some linkages to open all 4 barrels. But it's relatively simple. It just took a while to put together. My air intake temperature sensor is here, and that's pretty much the only sensor that I needed on this, since this runs a speed density system. I have it fastened with 2 large aluminum washers that thread into these standoffs, and everything stays really tight, works really well. There's no chance of this coming off or moving. And yeah, if you plan on doing a similar setup, just make sure this is going to work with what you're doing. The filter is kind of expensive, but it does allow, with an NA engine at this high horsepower, you need as much filtered air as you can possibly get, and you can't get any more than this style intake will allow. So unless you get like a round one or something, I'm sure you could get one of those even cheaper, but they don't look as good. So that's why we did this. Okay, so to start off with the suspension, we've got our billet 7075 aluminum S chassis kit. This is a fully machined piece where you have a 1-piece knuckle and a 2-piece arm. Connecting together right here with these 2 bolts. This is a custom sway bar that I built to clear the subframe, tuck up under here really nice while giving me the ability to go the full amount of angle on the trailing wheel. That's kind of the hardest thing to get with a rear rack and a front sway bar car, is how to get the most trail out of it. I just did a custom sway bar, modifying a 32mm bar, shortening it in the center, cutting the ends and adding on this adjustable piece. Really simple. You can buy sway bars from different companies that fit this kit pretty well. But yeah, we've got our PBM coilovers that we've been running for a couple years. Dave Briggs had these put together, and we've only changed a couple things about them to make them the way that we want, and otherwise they work really well. They've got a really nice thick shaft, which you want for a McPherson strut. We added these helper springs to allow for a lot more droop and grip on the trail wheel, as we like to 3-wheel a lot. This is going to prevent that and keep your traction planted. The kit itself is really user-friendly and really nice to have. So if you want to adjust your Ackerman, they're just swappable plates right here on the outer tie rod. We currently have it set up to run a 0 Ackerman setup, where depending on the track and its speed, we can easily go from negative to positive, +1, +2, -1, -2. And that is measured at full log. So at 70 degrees, you're gonna have a 2-degree difference. Obviously, the curve of the Ackerman changes throughout its range of travel. So you might have a difference in tow at 40 degrees than you will at 70 degrees. That's all I mean by that. But the kit itself is super lightweight, really easy to adjust bump stops and limit. It's got a really solid limit on it. And yeah, it gives the best feel I've ever had comparative to my steel kits that we sell. The geometry is identical. The only difference is this is a much lighter kit in terms of weight. Other than that, they're the same. This knuckle could actually bolt to the steel arm. The steel arms could bolt to this knuckle. So it's all also interchangeable. If you wanted to get a billet kit and then run steel spares, totally doable. That's the beauty of this stuff. So with that, caster is really easily adjusted, especially with the two-piece arm. We can just drop these two bolts, lengthen this arm, put it back. If you want to get any caster out of the lower, if you want to get caster in the top plate, you can simply rotate the top plate to adjust your caster and fine-tune that. We move the rack forward as far as possible. It's close to 50 millimeters relocated. We didn't use any special kit for that. We just designed our own plate ourselves and moved it forward. Without lifting the car, I can't really show you, but that basically covers the front. We run a Willwood caliper with an adapter plate onto our knuckle, and this gives us, again, a really lightweight two-piece rotor design with a Willwood caliper that we sized accordingly with our master cylinder, giving us really good brake force up front for any kind of left foot braking. We don't build up too much heat. We can lock up the wheels instantly if we want. And since we run a pedal box, it is ideal to size your own calipers and cylinders. Whereas when you're using factory brakes, you can't really get the ideal size unless you change up the master cylinder a lot. So yeah, everything works really well. It's the ideal setup, and there's lots of high-end kits available that if you want to build a car to this level, that you can compete with this by going with a different brand and have similar results. It's to each their own, but this is what I choose to run, and we tend to do pretty well in competition. At least up here in Canada. It'll be nice to get in the US and see how we do. But yeah, that's the front suspension anyways. In the rear, we have a dual caliper Willwood setup. The calipers are actually not the same. The bore on the handbrake is larger than the bore on the foot brake. The reason is because I don't need to run a evenly distributed foot pedal. I want most of my bias to be in the front, so my rear caliper doesn't need to be a larger size, whereas my handbrake, I want it to be an effortless pull. So there's a balance to be had between the piston size and the master cylinder size. Since I am running the standard 3/4 master cylinder in my handbrake, I went with a larger bore on the caliper itself, giving me tons of pressure to lock these instantly. It is literally a one finger, two finger pull, whatever, to lock the rear, and that is with some big sticky tires. So in the rear, we were able to gain a ton of mechanical grip for this chassis. There's a couple details to go into that a lot of pros know and use for this car. This car is a really popular car in pro, so there's a lot of known tricks of the trade to make these a fast chassis, but I can show you a couple of them that are all within FD rules. You can see a general configuration of our control arms, and then we've got our lowered front bracket on the lower control arm, dropped from its original mounting point. The reason we dropped the front of the lower control arms is to give us a lower anti-squat percentage and gain more mechanical grip from the chassis. There's a fine balance between your anti-squat percentage, your weight distribution, and how much mechanical grip that you can get. The majority of the grip that you're going to get can easily just be done with tires. Changing your tires, running a better tire, depending on what level you're at, and if you're restricted to a certain tire, simply changing tires can give you that grip advantage that you need. But when you're competing in a class where everyone's using the same tires, this is where you need to get that 5–10% gain or advantage over somebody else, is going into the kinematics of the rear kit. Getting in a little bit deeper here, we've got our billet aluminum knuckle with our toe arm brace. This toe arm bracket actually holds the suspension. It connects the toe arm to the knuckle, and it is an attachment point for my sway bar. So my sway bar is a chromoly tube that goes from one side of the car to the other on top of the rear tube frame, connected with this adjustable link directly to the knuckle, which is 50 mil away from the suspension mounting point. And we make these brackets beefy enough to be able to handle the load, which is anywhere between 300 and 500 pounds of force from one side of the vehicle to the other. When I do my sway bar calculation, that's how much load is putting on this joint whenever I'm on a heavy bank track or what have you. The cool thing about this rear suspension is that whenever you get into a accident or a wall tap or something where you're hitting the rear wheel, the tendency for a rear grip kit or any suspension in general is that the toe arm, either the arm, the knuckle, the bracket, the subframe, typically the rear of the wheel is getting the impact and it's going to affect your toe and destroy your toe setting. This toe bracket can easily be removed and replaced, and that is your designed fail point. It's still super tough, but if you do impact anything like a wall, chances are the only thing you're going to be replacing is this toe bracket. Yeah, that's how it was designed. It works really well. I'm happy to say that I've tested it, so didn't mean to, of course. In the back we have our PBM two-way adjustable coilovers. So the way that the rear kit was designed is it gives you a roll center correction adjustment. The way that the pickup points are put into the knuckle is essentially making an upper A-arm and a lower A-arm that are perfectly in line with one another to make any toe change completely linear throughout its travel range. And with the upper arms, as anyone that knows a S chassis, you have a traction arm and a camber arm on the upper mounts. Putting those two in line and then making an A-arm, it allows you to adjust the length of each one independently, and you can reduce or lengthen the traction arm really easily on the car. And then same with the camber arm, just by rotating them. You've got great axle clearance throughout its travel range, and it's a really user-friendly kit to set up and install and run and get the most out of your chassis. So inside the cockpit we have what looks to be a really little screen. That's because it is. My large screen is out getting repaired. Thankful that they're able to repair it for me because it just stopped working. So for my last event I just ran this little screen, which does give me all the information that I need. So just imagine that I have a nice touch screen here. With everything else that we've got, we have our kill switch, we've got our fire suppression system here, our Sparco steering wheel on a quick release. This is part of our steering column kit that we have, and our wheelwood pedal box is installed. Positioning the pedals on the wheelwood pedal box so that my feet can fit and my knees are not at an awkward angle. My seat is back as far as it can go. My elbows are nicely tucked in and everything is really easy to get at. Going through my gears, pulling my handbrake, and so on. It's just a really well designed and comfortable place to be. It's supposed to feel like you're sitting in an office, and when you're here, it's like you're at home. It's really nice to sit in here, even if you're just sitting in the pit. Even if you're just sitting in the pits, soaking up all that summer heat. The floor is super hot because all of your 4-inch exhaust is blasting the heat right under you, which I did put a nice heat shield. That's a lot better this year. But yeah, it gets pretty toasty in here, but pretty comfortable, especially if you got a cool suit going, which I would recommend with any pro car. This bar is what I was referring to, which is a bit low for my liking. If I did this cage, I would have put it much higher. Some of you might say, well, why don't you just redo it? Well, it's hard to find the time, I tell you. It would take a lot of time for me to cut this out and do it again, and I'm busy doing that for all of you guys, all my customers. So I just don't have the time, simply to put it. And I'm not gonna pay somebody else to do it because couldn't afford to do that either. So anyways, we have our ARC electric panel here. We've got just a quick label when I did it. I did this pretty close to the end of the season, changed my switch panel. They're actually nice. You can Velcro them on anywhere. Some people put them on their bar up here, some people put them here. But I've got my start, my ignition, my lights, my oil fans, which are up front, even my wipers. I can turn my wipers on. Power steering pump. The cool thing about my power steering system is that I can actually turn it on. I don't know if you can hear it or not, but it actually pressurizes the power steering system so that I can actually use it without the engine even running. Makes it really easy to push this in and out of the shop. So I'd recommend that to anybody. It makes it trailer loading, pushing in the shop. These cars, drift cars, are for some reason just so hard to push around. The welded diff with the big tires and the Ackerman that we run makes them just super difficult to push. They like to drift and they like to be in drift, but pushing them around with one guy, man, is it ever hard. Anyways, that makes it easier. So yeah, I would start it up for you, but we'll have lots of cuts of the car drifting and driving. And it's a really basic interior. A couple things I'd recommend is that in addition to your fire suppression system, that you also include a separate fire extinguisher, because any kind of minor fire that you have, you really don't want to be pulling that. You want to be, if it's a fire that's going on where you just notice the smoke and then you notice a little bit of flames and you have time to pull over, go over the scenario that you're in, and then say to yourself within the 5 seconds that you have that you can easily put it out with one of these and not destroy your car with the suppression system, or if you need to pull that. Both are accessible in and outside of the car, so don't make this your only line of defense. Get one of these. I put mine right in front of the seat. It's actually completely out of the way of my legs. I don't even notice that it's there, and it's probably the easiest spot to look. Quick releases are another big safety factor. I'm sure everybody has them anyways, but just getting in and out of the car quickly, and especially at my size, it just makes it really easy to get in and out. Get yourself a little hanger. You can put your steering wheel there. Maybe you have a decorative wheel, make it look cool. But yeah, the interior of this car is really simple. I made these door cards that you can see. This car, again, before I got it, the door was completely gutted, even the rebar. So the door is super flimsy. I installed this piece. It really stiffened up the door. Kind of looks cool, and it's still super light. So the door is now stiff, it closes well. And that's because these door bars are really close to the skin, so I'm assuming they couldn't fit whatever the factory rebar was. We're still doing a couple things to this car for next year. Actually, it's 2021, so for this year. Just some minor things, really cleaning up the aesthetics of it. We've got to go through the wiring, and I just made one modification when I went to do my clutch. The shifter actually bottomed out of my transmission tunnel, so I'm going to make a little removable box here so that I can easily pull the transmission off and down without having to touch anything else. I had to take the shifter off in order to drop it, so I'm gonna make that. There's not too much that I'm gonna do other than really just tidy everything up and make it even more serviceable. As you work on your car, you really notice what took you a long time, why did it take you so long, and how you can make it faster. Because when it comes down to it, the speed that you're able to replace parts and set up your car is going to pay off in the long run, especially if you're on a 5-minute or a 15-minute clock at competition to do whatever you need to do. Diagnosing, fixing, and repairing within that time range is everything. So that's the only upgrades we're going to be doing to this car, is making it just that much better. But this is a good example of the basics that you need to be competitive. You can go above and beyond what even I've done, but with the time that I've had, this is as good as it gets. There's always something to learn from everybody. Even I learn things from videos that I watch, and following YouTube channels like mine, or like a lot of the pro guys have their channels going. Just watching what they do and what they talk about. A lot of people aren't keeping all this information that big of a secret. Like, I mean, specific setups and alignment numbers might be team specific, but how we achieve it and what we're doing to make it able to achieve is not a secret. I just showed you basically everything that you need, other than underneath the car, which, I mean, underneath the car is just like your transmission mounts, all of your lines, a 4.5-inch exhaust system, and everything else that goes with that. It's really not that complicated underneath. Again, simpler is better. You can get pretty fancy with the exhaust, but mine is just basically from the headers back is pretty much just mild steel, because you can smash it in off the ground. You can do all kinds of stuff with it. It'll just bend. Stainless likes to break. Titanium's really sweet because it's light, but it also is expensive, so that's kind of out of your budget. Thin steel, there's nothing wrong with it. That's what I went with. Yeah, really easy to repair. Stuff like that at the track. That's another thing that you got to keep in mind, is when you're going with these higher end parts, How easily can you get spares? How fast can you switch them? Can you weld them? Can you fix them instantly? Like, a lot of aluminum stuff is, again, difficult to deal with if you're working on with like a lot of aluminum suspension bits. Repairing it is out of the question. Replacing it is the only answer. Can you replace it quickly? That's for you to decide. Can we replace my front end quickly? Yes, it can be replaced within a couple minutes. But yeah, really think about those aspects of your car. And one other thing that I didn't really point out is that this entire transmission top is actually removable, so that I can easily access anything in this panel. And I've got water lines, fuel lines, linkage for the GSR, pulling the transmission, and everything becomes so much easier when you can take this top off. This handbrake is also mounted to a really stiff structure, a tubular structure right to the side of my tunnel. Beefed it all up. The plate comes off around this so that when I pull on this, there is absolutely zero flex. You could probably lift the car off the ground if you could get a crane through here off of this mount, because yeah, I did not want this to move at all. So you can pull this as hard as you want. Luckily I don't need to because I sized my cylinders correctly, but yeah, everything's just really robustly and really well done. And I'm only going to change a couple minor things. So again, hope you guys learned something, and we'll see you on the next video.